Hello everyone, welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 164, and it's titled Leech Therapy. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So first up, we got to talk about our random card, of course. And our random card this week is Jade Leech. And Jade Leech is 2 green for a 5/5 leech that says green spells you play cost green more to play. And I'll be perfectly honest with you, when I first got this card as our card of the week, I had no idea what I was going to do with this because I could not figure out how to take a negative ability and turn it into something that's actually positive for us. And I was struggling to find a commander that fit, I was struggling to find a theme that fit, until eventually I found a pretty recent commander that I think actually works very well with Jade Leech, and that's because our commander this week is going to be the Beamtown Bullies. So the Beamtown Bullies are 1 black, red, green for a 4/4 legendary creature, Ogre Devil Warrior. It has vigilance and haste, and it taps and makes target opponent whose turn it is put target non-legendary creature card from your graveyard onto the battlefield under their control. It gains haste, goad it, and at the beginning of the next end step, exile it. So essentially what we want to be doing with the Beamtown Bullies and Jade Leech is if we can actually give our opponents control of the Jade Leech, they now have a 5/5 creature that has to attack, can't attack us, and is going to be preventing them from casting everything they want to be casting, provided they're at least a green deck. We are also, of course, playing the black and red leeches as well. We can't play the white and the blue ones, but we take what we can get. So we are going to be trying to give our opponents some leeches. And I know a lot of times when you see a Beamtown Bullies commander deck, the main focus of the deck is to make people lose the game on the spot. That is not what this deck is trying to do. So to explain that a little bit further, let's move into some of our themes and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So like I mentioned, normally Beamtown Bullies decks want to put things into play like a leveler that exiles someone's entire library. We don't want to do that. We don't want to just auto win the game. We want to be annoying. And so with that in mind, our first theme is, of course, being a nuisance. So we want to put creatures into play for our opponents that aren't going to knock them out of the game, but are really going to mess with their game plan. Really just kind of be, well, like I said earlier, annoying. We don't want necessarily to prevent people from playing the game. We just want them to really have to think about what they're doing. So a great example of this is Phyrexian Negator, which is 2 and a black for a 5/5 horror. It has trample, and whenever it is dealt damage, sacrifice that many permanents. So obviously this is not a great creature for us to have on the board because all we have to do is attack, someone block, and now we're sacrificing permanents. But giving it to an opponent and goading it means that it has to attack. So if someone has a huge creature that can block it, they can force that person to sacrifice a ton of permanents. Now, most likely, they'll be attacking the player who has the smallest creature that could block it, so they might have to sacrifice 1 or 2 permanents, but that's still going to be enough to just kind of get under their skin and be a little bit annoying. Now, with that being said, though, a lot of our creatures are not great. We do not want to be playing our creatures, which means that we don't really have a lot of ways to defend ourselves. And so that brings us to theme number 2, which is goading. We want to make sure that our opponents are attacking each other and not attacking us. So Vengeful Ancestor here is 2 red for a 3/4 spirit dragon. It's got flying. Whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, goad target creature, and whenever a goaded creature attacks, it deals 1 damage to its controller. So you have to remember, Beamtown Bullies does goad the creature we put into play, so that will trigger Vengeful Ancestor, but this is also a way to make sure that we can keep attacking our opponents, because we have a 3/4 flyer, it's going to be difficult to block, and we keep goading their things, keep doing damage to them, and we really just want to prevent our opponents from ever being able to attack us. Now, obviously, if it gets down to a one-on-one situation, goad is a little less good, so that's when we really need to take advantage of maybe we can be attacking with the Ancestor and the Beamtown Bullies and just kind of sneak in that extra little bit of damage. And then finally, that brings us to our third theme of the deck, which is mill. We want to mill ourselves, so that way we always have creatures in the graveyard to put into play under an opponent's control. We could just play the creatures ourselves, maybe sacrifice them or wait for someone else to kill them, but then that means that we have to play the creatures that can be annoying, and we don't want that. We want to put them into our graveyard directly, either from our hand, which we have some discard outlets, or from our library, because we don't want them on our side of the battlefield. So a great way to do that is Stitcher's Supplier, which is 1 black for a 1/1 zombie. When it enters the battlefield or dies, mill 3 cards. So just this card alone can mill us for a total of 6, which is very impressive. It's a pretty decent chunk of our deck, and there's a very good chance we'll hit at least 1 creature in those 6, meaning that we have something to put into play with the Beamtown Bullies. So that is what this deck is trying to do. Those are our major themes for this week. And so the next thing I want to do is take a look at some key cards. These are the cards that really synergize with what we're trying to do, and in some cases are either win conditions or value engines all on their own. So the first key card that I want to talk about is Spectacular Showdown. So typically when you think of goad spells, this is not the first one that comes to mind, but it's definitely a spell that has gone up and up in my opinion, and it's just really a finisher and a great way to close out the game, and just a phenomenal way to make your opponents take each other out. Because it is 1 and a red for a sorcery, put a double strike counter on target creature, then goad each creature that had a double strike counter put on it this way. It also has overload for 4 red, red, red. So we can take the biggest thing on the board, give it double strike, and send it somewhere else. But for 7 mana, we can give everything double strike and goad every single thing on the board. So you'll notice that it specifically says it puts a double strike counter on target creature and then goads each creature. This does not say creatures your opponents control, so it does also give our creatures double strike. And yes, they're goaded, so they do have to attack. So if you're concerned about that, then I would recommend casting this post-combat, then you don't even have to worry about it. But it's also a great way to give your stuff double strike and presumably make sure that your stuff with double strike doesn't die in the melee that's about to ensue. So Spectacular Showdown is really just that. It is a spectacular card. And yes, it's expensive. 7 mana is not cheap, but it's a great way to end the game once your opponents have a ton of things in play. Our next key card is not necessarily a win condition so much as it is an insurance policy, and that is Staff of Completion. So Staff of Completion is 3 mana for an artifact. You can tap it, pay 1 life, destroy target permanent you own, tap it, pay 2 life, add 1 mana of any color, tap it, pay 3 life, proliferate, tap it, pay 4 life, draw a card, and you can pay 5 mana to untap Staff of Completion. Most of these abilities are not going to be super relevant. We don't really have any reason to be proliferating. We don't really need a mana rock that costs us life. Yeah, the card draw is nice, but it is 4 life, so it is pretty expensive. Believe it or not, the most important ability on Staff of Completion is actually the first one. Being able to pay 1 life and destroy a permanent that we own becomes very relevant, because when we give away our creatures with Beamtown Bullies, they get exiled at the end of turn. But with Staff of Completion, we can actually destroy the creature before it gets exiled, putting it back into our graveyard to be used again with the Beamtown Bullies. There's not a ton of things that destroy target permanent that specifically we own for that cheap. So Staff of Completion, and there's a couple of other spells in here that do it too, but Staff of Completion obviously has the most other upside. So I did want to highlight that one. This is a great way to make sure that we can reuse some of our annoyances. And then finally, we get to our last key card of the deck, and that one is Plague Reaver. This is another card that I have found myself every single time I play it just kind of being impressed by it. It doesn't sound like it's going to do much, but once it's in play and doing things around the battlefield, it does start to become a bit of a nuisance. So Plague Reaver is 2 and a black for a 6/5 beast. but it has the massive downside that at the beginning of your end step, you sacrifice each other creature you control. Sounds like a great card to put into play under an opponent's control. And it also has the ability to discard 2 cards and sacrifice Plague Reaver, choose target opponent, return Plague Reaver to the battlefield under that player's control at the beginning of their next upkeep. So most of the time, Plague Reaver comes in, your opponents can use it because it's goaded as a 6/5 attacker, and most of the time, they're going to want to discard 2 cards and sacrifice it, meaning we are getting around the exile clause because they typically don't want to sacrifice all their other creatures, and then they're either giving it to us, which we can sacrifice it and give it away, or they're giving it to another opponent, meaning they now have to discard cards as well. So it's making the rounds around the table, not having to worry about getting exiled, making our opponents discard cards, and still being a 6/5 attacker, because at any point, if we get it back, we can discard cards, which puts cards in our graveyard, and we're happy with that. Or we can find other ways to sacrifice it, maybe Staff of Completion to destroy it. And even if we don't, it is still a 6/5 attacker, which can really do some damage throughout the course of a game. So before I ramble on too much about Plague Reaver, let's move on to the next piece of this deck tech, which is going to be cool interactions. And the cool interactions that I want to highlight are going to be 2 cards that either synergize very well together or just work together in a unique way. So the first cool interaction I want to highlight is between Soul Gorger Org and Goblin Bombardment. So I mentioned earlier that we don't have any instant win the game cards. We don't have anything that takes a player out immediately. This is probably the closest that we would get, and this is a 2-card combo that can't actually be tutored up. We have no reason to go and get this. We have no way to go and get this. But we have Soul Gorger Org, which is 3 red for a 6/6 Nightmare Org. It has Trample. When it comes into play, you lose all but 1 life, and when it leaves play, you gain life equal to the life you lost when it came into play. So this is a perfect card to give to an opponent. We give it to someone, they have a 6/6 Trample attacker, and of course their life goes to just 1. Now that 1 isn't dead. That means we have not taken that opponent out of the game. However, we could use Goblin Bombardment, which is 1 and a red for an enchantment, sacrifice a creature. Goblin Bombardment deals 1 damage to any target. So that opponent that's now at 1 life, all we've got to do is sacrifice a creature, presumably any creature we have in play, but we know that if we've put Soul Gorger Org into play under an opponent's control, that we will have the Beamtown Bullies. So worst case scenario, we sacrifice the Bullies, do 1 damage to that opponent, and then they die to the Org and the Bombardment, knocking them out of the game. Obviously, this is probably not something you want to do super early on in the game because it makes you look like a huge threat, and then everyone else will probably just take you out. But this is a great backup win condition once you've goaded maybe 2 players out of the game and it's 1-on-1, so your goad isn't as effective anymore. This is a great way to just kind of close things out and make sure that you walk away the winner despite the fact that goad was going to force your opponent to attack you. Now, that is only cool interaction number 1, so we do still have 1 more to discuss, and this one is going to be between Karazakar the Eye Tyrant and Disrupt Decorum. So Karazakar is 3 black-red for a 5/5 legendary creature beholder. Whenever you attack a player, tap target creature that player controls and goad it, and whenever an opponent attacks another one of your opponents, you and the attacking player each draw a card and lose 1 life. So obviously, if an opponent is attacking someone else because, maybe they're goaded, that means that they will be drawing a card and losing a life, and we are drawing a card and losing a life as well. So if we cast something like Disrupt Decorum, which is 2 red for a sorcery that just says goad all creatures you don't control, all of a sudden, each opponent has to attack another opponent, meaning we are drawing at least, bare minimum, 1 card on each opponent's turn, presumably more if they're attacking multiple opponents, and then they're also doing damage to each other, they're hurting each other, they're taking out their creatures. It's just going to be an absolute mess, and we will be the ones benefiting the most from it because of Karazakar. Now, obviously, there are other goad spells in the deck, so Karazakar does do more than just with Disrupt Decorum, but I wanted to highlight Decorum as it is the cheapest and most efficient way to goad all creatures at the table. So those are our cool interactions for the week. And the last thing we've got to do for our deck tech is talk a little bit about the price of the deck. So this week, our deck came in at $67.14, with the most expensive card being Ebon Blade Reaper at $8.29. An Ebon Blade Reaper is 2 and a black for a 1/1 cleric. Whenever it attacks, you lose half your life rounded up, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player loses half their life rounded up, and it has morph for 3 black. So I think the original intention behind this card was that you play it for its morph cost, you attack, and then once it has attacked and has not been able to trigger the attack trigger because it's attacked as a morph, you flip it face up, hit somebody, and you cause them to lose half their life. Obviously, that is not what we want this card to be doing, because if we put it into play under an opponent's control with the Beamtown Bullies, they have to attack, so whoever controls it will lose half their life, and then when they attack somebody else, they're either incentivized to probably block, or they take half their life as well. So this could be a great way to just do a ton of damage for a very cheap way, really, because there's not much our opponents can do when we're just getting something out of our graveyard. So Ebon Blade Reaper is a very expensive card, presumably for decks that are very similar to this one, but I think that it pulls its weight in this deck in particular. Now, obviously, if you do want to trim a little bit on the price of the deck, you can cut out the Reaper. It's not necessary to the overall game plan, but I do think that if you have the budget space for it, it is a very worthy include. Now, on the other hand, if you're looking for a card to put into the deck that's a little bit out of our budget, I do have a suggestion there for you as well. So the card that I would put in if you have a little bit of an extra space in your wallet would be 1000-Year Elixir. And 1000-Year Elixir is 3 mana for an artifact. You may activate abilities of creatures you control as though those creatures had haste, and you can pay 1 and tap it to untap target creature. Beamtown Bullies having a tap ability means that this gives us the chance to activate them on multiple opponents' turns to really mess up their game plans, rather than having to pick and choose one specific opponent to mess with every single go around the table. It is, though, $9.55, so it is a little bit out of our budget. However, if you don't mind squeezing that in, I do think it's a very worthy include. And of course, if you are putting a card into the deck, you do have to take a card out of the deck, so the card I would recommend would be Blim Comedic Genius. And Blim is 2 black-red for a 4/3 legendary creature imp. He's got flying. Whenever he deals combat damage to a player, that player gains control of target permanent you control. Then each player loses life and discards cards equal to the number of permanents they control but don't own. And this looks a little bit weird, because why would we necessarily want to get rid of Blim if Blim can give away our terrible things? And the short answer is we don't want to be casting our terrible things. We don't want to put those creatures into play under our control, because a lot of them have enter the battlefield effects or attacking or blocking, whatever it may be. And that's really just going to be messing up our own game plan. So Blim doesn't have a lot of chances to give things away. And then if he's not giving things away, obviously he's not going to be doing his ability to make each opponent lose life and discard cards equal to the number of permanents they control but don't own. And even if he did, they're being exiled at the end of turn anyway, and Blim has to attack and deal damage to do that, so it's very unlikely that ability ever actually means anything. And from what I've seen in my playtesting with this card, a lot of people see it and assume that this is the win condition, so they kind of just kill it, they remove it, they do something to make sure Blim can never hit them, and so it really doesn't do as much as I want it to do. I think Blim as a commander could be a very powerful card, but I don't think our deck is quite the right build for it. So if you do want to increase the power of the deck just a little bit, I would recommend swapping out Blim and putting in 1000-Year Elixir, because it just feels like it fits the theme of the deck quite a bit more than Blim does. Now, With that being said, though, that is the extent of our deck tech. And before we get into a game with this deck, because, we always got to get a game in and see how it performs, I want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel, and I want to shout out our current patrons and channel members. So if you're interested, you can always just like the video and subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit. But if you're looking to go a little bit above and beyond, you can find us on a ton of social media sites, and as well as Patreon and right here on YouTube as a channel member, where you get access to a Discord where we brew up a lot of the decks and also play the games that appear on the channel. I give you the guarantee that any of the cards you suggest will be turned into a video eventually. Obviously, you are more than welcome to suggest cards in general. Please put them in the comments, send them to me on Reddit, Twitter, email, doesn't matter. I'm happy to hear all of them, and I will do my best to get to all of them, but I can't promise to get to them the same way I can for our patrons and channel members. Plus, there's some other cool benefits in there, like getting access to deck lists a week early and different things like that. So, with that being said, I want to give a quick shout out to all of our amazing patrons, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Hui, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, Patty Weck, Richard, and Devin Purser. So to all of you, thank you all so much for all of your support. And like I said, if you want to join any of their names on this list, check us out on Patreon or right here on YouTube. But with all of that being said, let's move on to the game for this week and test out our Leech Therapy, see how we can do. So this week we are being joined by 3 opponents, and in this case it is going to be Richard playing Varric Warped Sengir, Luke playing God Eternal Oketra, and Guillaume Master Chef being played by Cow. So starting off with Varric and Richard's build, this is, from his own words, pretty much a fetch land deck. He wants to play every single fetch land that he possibly can, anything that can fetch up a white or a black mana source. And so the main reason he wants to be doing that is because this is actually a landfall deck, because Varric allows him to copy the effects of the fetch land. So he can sacrifice something like a Marsh Flats, pay the life, copy it with Varric, and get 2 lands out of his deck and put them into play, letting him double up on a lot of his landfall synergies. So I've never played against a Varric deck before, but just from the way he describes it, it sounds very, very powerful. So I think if I had to point to any of these decks as the most concerning, it's probably that. Orzhov Ramp feels like a very powerful strategy. Moving along, though, we have Luke's God Eternal Oketra deck, and this is pretty much your typical God Eternal Oketra deck. He wants to play a ton of mono white value creatures, cards that can bounce other cards back to his hand, so he can constantly be making a bunch of zombies, and then he just wants to run over his opponents with the zombie warrior tokens. So I'm a big fan of mono white. It's my personal favorite archetype, so I love seeing God Eternal Oketra. I think it's a very powerful creature and definitely a great way to showcase some of the uniqueness in mono white. And then finally, we have Cow playing Guillaume, and this is, again, kind of exactly what it looks like. This is a food deck, so he really wants to take advantage of making a ton of food, making a ton of artifact tokens, being able to gain life, and just all the shenanigans that kind of come with this. Now, I've played against Cow's Guillaume deck a couple of times, and usually when you say food decks, it doesn't seem incredibly powerful, but this deck has kicked my butt many times, so I am very impressed by Guillaume and the food synergies that it can really showcase. So I do know this is definitely a threat at the table. However, I do still want to say Varric is probably the most concerning, because I know what an Orzhov deck can do when it has access to near unlimited amounts of mana. Usually that involves draining people of a ton of life. So we'll see how this game goes. Let me know down in the comments what your predictions are. Let me know who you think is going to win, maybe who you think has the best deck. And then, of course, at the end of it, we'll see what you think. So let's jump into this. I'm sure I'm going to have a great time. I hope you do as well. And I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by Richard, Luke, and then Cow. On my first turn, I play a mountain. Richard plays a swamp. Luke plays a plains, casts a soul ring, and then uses that to cast a pearl medallion, making all his white spells cost 1 less to cast. Cow plays a Llanowar Wastes and casts Llanowar Elves. I play a Gyre Reach Sanitarium. Richard plays a Marsh Flats, sacrificing it and losing a life to search his library for a Plains, putting it into play. This lets him cast Priest of Fell Rites, which he can tap, pay 3 life, and sacrifice it to return a creature from his graveyard to the battlefield. Luke plays a Plains and casts his commander, God Eternal Oketra, letting him make a 4/4 zombie token with Vigilance whenever he casts a creature. Cal plays a Blighted Woodland and casts his own Soul Ring, and then also cast Rampant Growth, searching his library for a basic land and putting it into play tapped. After that, he cast Baleful Mastery for its student cost, letting me draw a card and exiling God Eternal Oketra. I play a Mountain and cast a Bothersome Quasit, preventing my opponent's goaded creatures from blocking, and also goading target creature whenever I cast a non-creature spell. Richard plays a Plains and casts his commander Varric Warped Sengir, so now, whenever he pays life to activate a non-mana ability, he can pay the life again to copy it. Luke plays a Minas Tirith and casts Arcane Signet. Cal plays a Hostile. I play a Temple of Malady, scrying 1, and then move to combat, attacking Luke for 3. Richard plays a Polluted Delta, sacrificing it, paying a life, and then paying another life with Varric, copying the ability to search his library for 2 lands, specifically Snowfield Sinkhole and a Swamp, putting them into play. He then cast Court of Ardenvale, becoming the Monarch, and in his upkeep, letting him return a permanent with mana value 3 or less from his graveyard to his hand, or, if he's the Monarch, to the battlefield. Then at the end of turn, Richard draws for being the Monarch. Luke plays a Plains and recasts his commander, God Eternal Oketra. He then casts a Rescuer Chwinga, making a 4/4 zombie token, and at the end of turn, Cal sacrifices his Blighted Woodland to search his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. On Cal's turn, he plays a Swamp and casts Ambition's Cost, paying 3 life to draw 3 cards. He then casts Arcane Signet, and also casts Runic Armasaur, letting him draw a card whenever an opponent activates an ability of a creature or land that isn't a mana ability. In response, I activate Gaia Reach Sanitarium, making each player draw a card and then discard a card. On my turn, I cast Entish Restoration, sacrificing a mountain to search my library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. This also triggers the Quasit, goading Varric, and since Varric can no longer block, I'm able to attack Richard for 3 with the Quasit, taking the Monarchy and drawing for it at the end of turn. In my second main phase, I play a Rakdos Carnarium, returning Gaia Reach Sanitarium to my hand. In Richard's upkeep, he returns Marsh Flats to his hand with Court of Ardenvale, casts Swords to Plowshares, exiling Runic Armasaur and letting Cal gain 2 life. After that resolves, Richard casts a Emeria Angel, which lets him make a 1/1 bird token whenever a land enters under his control. He then plays a Marsh Flats, making a bird, before sacrificing the fetch land, paying a life and using his commander to pay another life, copying the ability, searching his library for 2 plains, putting them into play and making 2 more birds. He moves to combat, attacking Luke for 2 with his commander, gaining 2 life, and attacks me for 2 with the Priest of Fell Rites, reclaiming the Monarchy and then drawing for it at the end of turn. On Luke's turn, he casts Tocasia's Welcome, letting him draw a card once per turn when a creature with mana value 3 or less enters under his control. After that, he casts Knight of the White Orchid, making a zombie token, drawing a card, and searching his library for a plains, putting it into play since an opponent controls more lands than he does. After that, he casts Lauren of the Third Path, making another zombie and destroying Court of Ardenvale when she enters. He moves to combat, attacking me for 4 with a zombie, and attacks Richard for 6 with Oketra, but Richard blocks with Emeria Angel, killing it and taking no damage. At the end of turn, Richard casts Brought Back, returning 2 permanents from his graveyard to the battlefield that were put there this turn, getting back Court of Ardenvale and Emeria Angel. Cal plays a forest and casts his commander Guillaume Master Chef, letting him make a number of food tokens in his end step equal to the number of non-token creatures that entered under his control this turn. He then casts Trail of Crumbs, making a food token when it enters, and letting him pay 1 whenever he sacrifices a food to look at the top 2 cards of his library and reveal a permanent from among them to put into his hand. After that, he casts Feign the Broker, and in his end step, Cal makes 2 more food tokens with Guillaume. On my turn, I replay the Gaia Reach Sanitarium and cast Bitter Reunion, goading Oketra on cast, and also discarding Golgari Grave Troll to draw 2. However, since I discarded the troll, I can use its Dredge 6 ability to replace one of the card draws, returning it to my hand from the graveyard and milling myself for 6 instead. Once that's resolved, I cast Stitcher's Supplier, milling myself for 3 when it enters, and finally I cast my commander, the Beamtown Bullies, which can tap to put target creature from my graveyard onto the battlefield under the control of the opponent whose turn it is, goading it, giving it haste, and exiling it at the end of turn. In Richard's upkeep, he returns Marsh Flats from his graveyard to the battlefield with Court of Ardenvale since he's still the Monarch, also making another bird. He also plays Verdant Catacombs, making a bird, and casts Sun Titan, returning Polluted Delta from his graveyard to the battlefield, making yet another bird. He sacrifices both the Polluted Delta and Marsh Flats, losing 2 life and paying an additional 2 life to search his library for 4 total lands, putting them all into play and making 4 more bird tokens. Once that's resolved, he casts Felidar Retreat, letting him make a 2/2 cat token, or put a +1/+1 counter on all his creatures and give them vigilance until the end of turn whenever he plays a land. He then sacrifices the Verdant Catacombs, paying 2 life to copy it, searching his library for 2 lands, putting them into play, making 2 bird tokens, and putting 2 +1/+1 counters on all his creatures. Before Richard moves to combat, I activate Beamtown Bullies, tapping it to put Plague Reaver into play under his control, goading it and giving it haste. Notably, it also forces Richard to sacrifice all his other creatures in his end step, or he can discard 2 cards and sacrifice the Reaver to give it to another player in their upkeep. Then he attacks Luke for 6 with the Reaver, me for 14 with a Maria Angel and 3 birds, and Cal for 4 with Varric. Luke blocks the Reaver with Knight of the White Orchid, killing it, then Cal and I take the damage. In Richard's second main phase, he discards 2 cards to sacrifice Plague Reaver, giving control of it to Cal in his upkeep, and then draws a turn for being the Monarch. Luke casts Thraben Inspector, making another zombie token, drawing a card and investigating. He then plays a Plains and activates Lauren, giving himself and Cal both the ability to draw a card. After that, he casts a Grasp of Fate, exiling a permanent for each opponent until it leaves the battlefield, exiling Bothersome Quasit, Felidar Retreat, and Feign the Broker. After that, he casts True Conviction, giving all his creatures Double Strike and Lifelink. This lets him attack me with the Chwinga for 4, and attack Richard with Oketra and his zombies for 30. I block with Stitcher's Supplier, milling myself for 3 when it dies, and Richard blocks with 3 birds and Sun Titan, killing the birds and Oketra, while Luke gains 20 life. In Cal's upkeep, Plague Reaver comes into play under his control, then he casts Reclamation Sage, destroying Court of Ardenvale, then he casts Null Mage Advocate, letting him tap it to return 2 cards from an opponent's graveyard to their hand to destroy an artifact or enchantment. After that, he activates Hostile to sacrifice the Plague Reaver and put a soul counter on it. Then, at the end of turn, Cal makes 3 food tokens with Guillaume. When I draw for my turn, I dredge Stinkweed Imp, milling myself for 5 and returning it from my graveyard to my hand. After that resolves, I play a Swamp and cast Old Stick Fingers for X = 6, revealing cards from the top of my library until I reveal 6 creatures, putting the creatures into my graveyard and the rest on the bottom of my library. This winds up having me put Goblin Racketeer, Grenzo Havoc Raiser, Slicer Hired Muscle, Path Raiser of Ulamog, Ruby Leech, and Abyssal Persecutor into my graveyard. On Richard's turn, he cast Expedition Map, immediately sacrificing it to search his library for a land, in this case Westvale Abbey, putting it into his hand. He activates Priest of Fell Rites, sacrificing it and paying 3 life, to return Caustic Crawler from his graveyard to the battlefield, letting him give a creature -1/-1 until the end of turn whenever a land enters under his control. He plays a Vault of the Archangel, making a bird token and giving Guillaume -1/-1 until the end of turn, and after that he casts Shepherd of the Cosmos, returning a permanent mana value 2 or less, in this case Marsh Flats, from his graveyard to the battlefield, making another bird and giving Guillaume -1/-1. Then he sacrifices Marsh Flats, paying 2 life to copy it, searching his library for 2 lands, putting them into play, making 2 more birds, and giving Guillaume another -1/-1, killing it, and also giving Lauren -1/-1, killing her. He then attacks Luke with all his flying creatures for 27 total damage, and me for 8 with Sun Titan, returning Marsh Flats from his graveyard to the battlefield when it attacks, making another bird and giving Reclamation Sage -1/-1, killing it. Before the damage, he activates Vault of the Archangel to give his creatures Death Touch and Lifelink, and sacrifices Marsh Flats, paying 2 life to copy it, searching his library for 2 more lands, putting them into play, making 2 birds, and giving Rescuer Chwinga -2/-2, killing it. Then I block Sun Titan with Stick Fingers, which is a 14/14, killing them both, and Luke takes 27, while Richard gains 35 and draws for being the Monarch. On Luke's turn, he sacrifices a clue to draw a card, plays a Mary of the Sky Ruin, and attacks Richard for 32 with all his zombies, but Richard blocks with 4 birds, killing them and taking no damage, while Luke gains 16. Second main phase, he activates Minas Tirith, drawing a card, and at the end of turn, Cow sacrifices a food, gaining 3 life, paying for Trail of Crumbs, looking at the top 2 cards of his library, revealing Temple of the False God from among them, and putting it into his hand. He then plays the Temple of the False God for his turn, casts a Wicked Wolf, which allows Cow to sacrifice a food, tap the wolf, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and give it indestructible until the end of turn. Additionally, it fights a creature when it enters the battlefield, choosing Varric, so Cow sacrifices 2 food to give Wicked Wolf 2 +1/+1 counters, making it big enough to kill Varric and letting Richard gain 5 life. Cow also activates Trail of Crumbs twice, revealing both Inspiring Statuary and Tainted Wood, putting them into his hand. After that resolves, he casts Inspired Statuary, giving his non-artifact spells Improvise, and casts Ob Nixilis Reignited, activating his -3 ability to destroy Emeria Angel. Before Cow moves to combat, I activate Beamtown Bullies to put Anji's Ravager into play under Cow's control, goading it and giving it haste. This means he's able to attack Richard for 3, discarding his hand and drawing 3 new cards, while Richard blocks with a bird, killing the token and taking no damage. Then at the end of turn, the Ravager is exiled. On my turn, I cast Gravebreaker Lamia, searching my library for a card, in this case Hellcarver Demon, putting it into my graveyard. After that, I cast Stinkweed Imp and play a Path of Ancestry. Richard plays a Westvale Abbey, giving Llanowar Elves -1/-1, killing it. Then he recasts his commander Varric, but before Richard can move to combat, I activate Beamtown Bullies to put Hellcarver Demon into play under his control. To prevent himself from having to attack with the demon and sacrifice all his permanents, Richard activates Westvale Abbey, sacrificing the demon and 4 birds to transform the land into Ormondal Profane Prince. He then attacks me for 27 with his flying attackers, and I block Ormondal with Stinkweed Imp, killing the imp, taking 18 damage, going to only 2 life, while Richard gains another 9. On Luke's turn, he recasts his commander Oketra, then plays a Plains and cycles Secluded Steppe before casting Fiend Hunter, making a zombie, drawing a card, and exiling Ormondal until it leaves the battlefield. He attacks Richard for 26 with his zombies and Inspector, and then also attacks Ob Nixilis for 8 with another zombie. Before the blocks, Richard channels Iganjo, Seed of the Empire, to do 4 damage to an attacking zombie, but Luke responds by casting Flawless Maneuver for free since he controls his commander, giving all his creatures indestructible until the end of turn. Cow blocks with Null Mage Advocate, and before damage, Cow activates it to return Goblin Bombardment and Slicer from my graveyard to my hand, destroying Luke's True Conviction. This means that the Advocate dies while Richard takes 13 damage, Luke becomes the Monarch, drawing for it at the end of turn. On Cow's turn, he activates Ob's +1 ability, drawing a card and losing a life. Then he plays a Swamp and casts Blood Money, destroying all creatures and making a tapped treasure token for each non-token creature destroyed this way, which is 7. In response, Richard activates Leech-ridden Swamp since he still controls 2 black permanents, making each opponent lose a life. Still before the board wipe resolves, Cow sacrifices a food token to put a +1/+1 counter on Wicked Wolf, tapping it, giving it indestructible until the end of turn, and putting Witch's Oven into his hand with Trail of Crumbs. Once everything is resolved, Cow casts the Witch's Oven, which lets him sacrifice a creature to make a food, or, if the creature had power 4 or greater, 2 food. He also casts Bloodghast, which has haste since an opponent has less than 10 life, letting him immediately attack Luke with it for 2, claiming the Monarchy. After that, he recasts his commander Guillaume, and in his end step, he makes 2 food tokens and draws for being the Monarch. When I draw for my turn, I instead dredge the Stinkweed Imp, milling myself for 5 and putting the imp back into my hand. I then recast my commander, the Beamtown Bullies, and cast Goblin Bombardment, letting me sacrifice a creature to do 1 damage to any target. I move to combat, attacking Richard for 4, taking the Monarchy and drawing for it at the end of turn. Also at the end of turn, Richard activates Westvale Abbey, making a 1/1 Cleric token. On Richard's turn, he casts Ob Nixilis the Fallen, which does 3 damage to an opponent and gets 3 +1/+1 counters whenever Richard plays a land. He then recasts his commander Varric and plays an Arid Mesa, putting 3 +1/+1 counters on Ob Nixilis and doing 3 damage to Cow. He then sacrifices the Arid Mesa, paying 2 life to copy it, searching his library for 2 lands, putting them both into play, putting 6 more counters on Ob Nixilis and doing 6 more damage to Cow. Luke plays a Plains and casts Aviary Mechanic, drawing a card and returning Soul Ring to his hand, letting him recast the Soul Ring, and then also cast Welcoming Vampire, drawing a card once a turn when a creature with power 2 or less enters under his control. At the end of turn, Cow sacrifices Bloodghast with the Witch's Oven, making a food token. On Cow's turn, he plays a Temple of Malady, scrying 1 and returning Bloodghast from the graveyard to the battlefield. He also casts Ravenous Squirrel, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever Cow sacrifices a creature or artifact. Then he activates Ob Nixilis' -3 ability, killing the Planeswalker to destroy Richard's Ob Nixilis. Once that's resolved, he casts Nadir's Nightblade, gaining a life and making each opponent lose a life whenever a token he controls leaves the battlefield. In response, I activate Beamtown Bullies to put Dire Fleet Ravager into play under Cow's control, making each player lose 1/3 of their life rounded up. In response to that, Richard activates Leech-ridden Swamp to make each opponent lose a life. Still in response, Luke casts Swords to Plowshares, exiling Beamtown Bullies, letting me gain 4 life so I survive both the Swamp activation and the Ravager. Cow then moves to combat, attacking me for 2 with Bloodghast, taking the Monarchy and knocking me out of the game. Then he also attacks Richard for 9 with Guillaume and the Dire Fleet Ravager, and attacks Luke for 6 with Wicked Wolf, which he blocks with his mechanic, killing it and taking no damage. In Cow's end step, he makes 3 food tokens and draws for being the Monarch. Still at the end of turn, Richard activates Westvale Abbey, paying 2 total life to copy the activation and make 2 clerics. On Richard's turn, he casts Admonition Angel, exiling a creature until the angel leaves play whenever a land enters under his control. He then plays a Swamp, exiling Nadir's Nightblade. In response, Cow sacrifices a food to gain 4 total life, make each opponent lose a life, and put Bootlegger's Stash into his hand with Trail of Crumbs. He then sacrifices another food, paying with treasures to do so he gains a total of 6 life, while each of his opponents lose 3, and he puts Feasting Troll King into his hand with Trail of Crumbs. Cow repeats this process again using treasures, so he gains 6 more life while his opponents lose 3, and he puts Mirkwood Bats into his hand with Trail of Crumbs. Finally, he sacrifices the Nightblade to Witch's Oven, making another food, fizzling the Exile ability from the Admonition Angel, and ending with 8 +1/+1 counters on Ravenous Squirrel. After that, Richard moves to combat, attacking Cow for 2 with Varric, gaining 2 life and becoming Monarch. In Luke's upkeep, marry the Sky Ruin triggers since he has 7 or more planes, returning Fiend Hunter from his graveyard to the battlefield, drawing 2 and exiling Ravenous Squirrel when it enters. In response, Cow sacrifices the squirrel to its own ability, gaining a life and drawing a card. Luke then recasts his commander, God Eternal Oketra, casts Emancipation Angel, making a zombie token and returning itself to his hand when it enters, letting him repeat this process 2 more times, getting 2 more zombies, and then finally returning Fiend Hunter to his hand so he can recast that, making a zombie and exiling Guillaume when it enters. Luke then moves to combat, attacking Cal for 2 with Welcoming Vampire, and in his second main phase plays a Tyrite Sanctum. On Cow's turn, he casts Mirkwood Bats, making each opponent lose a life whenever a token enters or leaves his battlefield. After that, he sacrifices 3 treasures, making each opponent lose 3 life, to cast Bootlegger's Stash, letting his lands tap to create a treasure token. This gives him the ability to make and sacrifice 8 treasures to do 16 damage, plus sacrifice 6 food to make each opponent lose 22 total life, knocking both Richard and Luke out, winning Cow the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. I was very happy with how the Beamtown Bullies performed in this game. I definitely felt like I was being a nuisance to everybody else at the table, but I didn't feel like I was overly being a problem, if that makes any sense. And this is something that I talked to everyone else after the game about as well. And they kind of agreed that this felt like a fun way to play the Beamtown Bullies, which is a commander that really gets a lot of hate because there are things like a Leveler or maybe Eldrazi in there, things that can really mess up people's days. And so making it a little less powerful but a little bit more chaotic, I think brought out a lot more fun at the table. And if I'm being perfectly honest, this game was a ton of fun to play. I knew pretty early on I didn't think we were going to win, but we definitely made an impact along the way, and sometimes that's really the best that you can hope for. Now, with that being said, that's not to say that this deck can't win. There were definitely a few moments when I felt like we had a great way to do it. Putting Hellcarver Demon into play under someone's control is a great way to make sure that they're kind of out of the game. We had the Org and the Goblin Bombardment to take somebody out, but unfortunately Cow had some life gain, so he was able to get around it. So it really felt like a deck that had the potential. It just wasn't quite our day. Now, with that being said, we're going to work our way around the table, talk about everyone else's decks, because they all deserve a chance to shine. Richard's deck was very, very powerful. I was very impressed by the amount of fetch land recursion he had, being able to get a ton of landfall triggers, being able to get a ton of lands out of his deck. He even mentioned at one point that he was starting to run out of fetchable lands, which is very impressive for an Orzhov deck. The only problem he really ran into is that he couldn't find anything to do with it. He didn't have a great source of card draw, so as the game progressed, he started to run out of gas and couldn't quite find ways to deal with everything that was happening. So I think that if he'd had just a few more card draw engines, there's a very good chance he could have run away with that game. Next up, though, we got Luke playing God Eternal Oketra. That deck also very powerful. I'm always impressed by God Eternal Oketra when I see her. She just absolutely floods the board with a ton of zombie tokens, and Luke's build is very impressive considering he wants to focus in on making sure that he can bounce his own creatures to replay them and just keep making zombies. The true conviction in that game really put his deck into overdrive, being able to turn his 4/4 zombies essentially into 8/8 lifelinkers really put him way above the rest of the table. So that was very, very impressive and a ton of fun to watch. And then finally, we had Cow's food deck, and it's got a lot of upgrades recently, specifically from the Lord of the Rings set. So it was cool to see some of the upgrades since I hadn't played against it in a while. But being able to see the token themes and being able to see the artifact themes really highlights just how strong the food deck has become recently. And there's a lot of very powerful cards that on their own don't seem particularly impressive. For example, Wicked Wolf was used very well in that game. Just a 3/3 that fights something when it comes in and can slowly grow and make itself indestructible if you sacrifice foods seems okay, but not game winning. But in that game, it really did play a role by taking out people's commanders and having pretty much the only body left on board after a board wipe. So I think Wicked Wolf really showcases that food in general is very, very strong. And Cow's deck was just incredibly impressive throughout that entire game. So I won't ramble on too much about the decks. I definitely could. Like I said, this was a super fun game to play. But let me know down in the comments what you thought of everybody's decks. Let me know what you thought of our deck. If there's any cards you think you would add or take out. Maybe if you have a Beamtown Bullies deck that's a little bit more hardcore than this one, I would love to see the list for it, because I know there are definitely ways to make this commander very, very strong. So thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the deck tech. Hope you enjoyed the video. And if you did, you can always, of course, just like the video and subscribe to the channel. But with all that being said, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.